Canada is perhaps one of the most unique countries in the world. You rarely find it in world geopolitical reports, but it comes to high standard of living. The country flashes constantly. It is quietly developing in the shadow of the older brother of the United States, which takes attention in politics for the entire continent. But what kind of country is Canada, which has the world's second largest territory? Where did it come from? Whose descendants inhabited it? What did the ancestors of hockey fans do? Sit back, friends. In the next few minutes, we will summarize everything. And as usual, feel free to write in the comments the countries you would like to know about in the next issues. Well, now we will travel into the distant past. For a long time, the dominant theory was that humans came to North America from Asia about 12,000 years ago. Siberia and Alaska were then connected by land, and the genetic analysis of the remains of the most ancient Aborigines from the Canadian territories definitely shows kinship with Asians. But recently, two more theories have appeared at once. The first is that Asians migrated to North America much earlier. In the north of the Yukon, there are excavations of a 26,000-year-old human site, and some scientists shift the boundaries even up to 50,000 years, stating that people lived in today's Canada for a very long time. Taking into account the existence of archaeological evidence, this theory can be believed. But in the second, now quite popular in certain circles, I don't really want to believe, because it says that the Asians who arrived in North America were not the first people on the continent. Allegedly, Cro-Magnon descendants of Europeans already lived here, and Asian newcomers forced them out. This point of view can now often be appeared in Western forums, but there is no good evidence base for that. Yet for now, it's more correct to consider that the Asians were the first settled in Canada and North America through a land bridge with Alaska, which given the Ice Age was a very serious achievement. In fact, 20,000 years ago, almost all of Canada was a continuous glacier, and the first settlers, of course, once came to the continent, migrated much further south. A common misconception is that Eskimos, who lived in Canada as well, are the descendants of the very first settlers of North America. But in reality, according to most modern scientists, the Eskimos were among the last, and the first colonizers primarily went south, and only after that settled in the northernmost regions. Unfortunately, due to the lack of written sources, we know very little about their life. We only know that it would be quite incorrect to say that Indians did not go beyond primitive societies. On the territory of Canada, there were about 12 language groups, 50 tribal unions, and their own kind of economy. The east of the country was inhabited by the Hurons, the Iroquois, the Ottawas, and other tribes, who even managed to move away from the nomadic life by way of building villages for permanent residence. There were imposed supplies between settlements, and we have evidence of trade, hunting, and even farming. Before the contact with Europeans, even the Iroquois Confederation was created, which included 5 large tribes. There were political tensions, alliances, and fairly large volumes of trade between them and other Native Americans. Ancestors of the Canadians even managed to avoid the first attempt of colonization. The Icelandic Vikings set foot on the island of Newfoundland in the 11th century and founded a small village there, the remains of which still exist today. Leif Erikson even named the continent Vinlandia. According to the analysis of wooden objects at the Viking site, it was concluded that they were cut down in 1021. However, Vikings could not gain a foothold on the continent, and there is an opinion that they didn't really want to. It is the Vikings, and not Columbus, whom scientists now attribute not only the discovery, but also the first contact with the indigenous population of North America. Moreover, somewhere at the same 11th century, the Vikings brought a woman from Newfoundland to Iceland, and her genotype is even now traced in Iceland, and very distant relatives of that representative of the Indians now still live in the country. But otherwise, the topic of the presence of the Vikings in today's Canada is still being studied, and there is an opinion that we still have not found a real big Vikings village. Well, as a real deal, Canada and North America were taken up after the travel of Columbus. In 1497, the navigator Giovanni Cabot proclaimed new land as the domain of the English king and made the first map of the East Coast. A little later, the fishermen joined the case. At the beginning of the 15th century, Basques from the north of Spain and the south of France began to fish and hunt whales, having founded there a dozen outposts. They liked Newfoundland and Labrador, and there they founded the village of Red Bay, a real metropolis of fishermen with a population of almost 1,000 people. Actually, humanity owes Newfoundland the appearance of the not-so-good term Redskins. The Beothuk, a tribe that inhabited the island, have been painting their faces and clothes with red ochre since antiquity. They first met the Vikings, and one of the first with Europeans at the turn of the 15th and 16th century. Because of the red ochre, an offensive nickname eventually stuck to all Indians. And the very word Indians also keeps a funny story. After all, Europeans discovered America in search of ways to India, so they called the first people they met Indians. At first, nothing but research and fishing interests moved the Europeans. They made maps, landed settles as small missions, and looked for landmarks to facilitate navigation. But later, as all you know, the colonial fever began. In Canada, it happened almost earlier than in the US. In 1534, Jacques Cartier dutifully explored the new land, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and finally landed near present-day territory of Quebec. There, Jacques struck a cross in the ground, declaring that it was now the land of the French king. A little later, Cartier also met with leaders of the Iroquois, declaring claims to the territory. And there the word Canada was born. Jacques passed a pair of captured Iroquois and heard them repeat the word Canada. In their language, it translates as village. Well, Cartier, without worrying, called the whole territory that way. And by the middle of the 16th century, the word Canada appeared on maps denoting the neighborhood of present-day Quebec. Jacques did much more to explore the continent, even founding a couple of settlements and reaching modern Montreal. But the next milestone was the beginning of the 17th century. Then the King of France gave to French merchants a monopoly on the fur trade. In this light, fur-rich Canada has become even more attractive. Despite the difficult conditions, the French, like a tanks, flooded the continent. Annapolis was founded in 1605, and already in 1608, Quebec, which was immediately named the capital of New France, the term which by that time had already taken root. By and large, there were trading outposts for furs. The first Catholic missionaries arrived in 1615, and in 1617, Louis Gerber arrived in Quebec. He is considered the first non-trade and navigator settler in Canada. The country's history textbooks like to mention that, unlike the United States, the colonization of Canada was not as brutal. That, of course, was not entirely true. Yes, Samuel de Champlain, the first governor of Quebec, established good relations with the Hurons and a couple of other Indian tribes. They made even some strategic alliances. But apart from that, things went according to similar schemes as in the United States. At first, they were friends with the Indians. Then they traded with them. Then they began to use them, and in the end, they evicted Indians from their territories. Because as the profitability of the colonies grew, they attracted the attention of the authorities. Along the way, the Indians were terribly amenable to diseases brought from Europe, to which the indigenous inhabitants of the continent had no immunity. Plague, cholera, smallpox, malaria, and other joys of European life in places cut the population of Indian tribes by half or more. And French were not much different from Brits in terms of the invasion of new territories. For example, they also converted Indians into their religion. In Quebec, there was founded a college where the Huron Indians went. But at the beginning of the 17th century, a third force stepped in. It was good old Englishmen, who were not happy with the dominance of the French in Canada. The British took advantage of the internal disassembly of the Indians. Because the Hurons did not get along with the Iroquois, British made the latter their strategic allies, supplying them with resources. This led to a whole series of events. The Iroquois massacred the Hurons. The Hurons massacred the Iroquois, and when between France and England the 30 Years' War broke out, this also backfired into chaos in the New World. In 1629, the Kirk brothers even captured French Quebec, and for 3 years they controlled all trade. Along the way, New England and Newfoundland were increasingly probed by the British, and by the end of the 17th century, their colonies were much richer than French ones. The French were on the alert, and even transformed New France from a de facto private campaign into an official colony. But still, they could not equal the power of the British. The Londoners first started the Hudson Bay Fur Sales campaign. Then they deepened cooperation with the Iroquois and crushed New France from all sides. In 1690, another attempt was made to capture Quebec, and even if the British failed there, after the War of Spanish Succession, their dominant position in the region was officially formalized. And when the 7-Year War broke out, New France was officially squeezed out. In 1759, 13,000 French and 9,000 English clashed at Quebec. Because of technical superiority, the Quebec garrison catapulted, and according to the Paris Peace Treaty, following the results of the 7-Year War, all of New France became known as the Province of Quebec. and was ruled by the British Crown. It is worth to note that the British tried to listen to the French population, and for example, they even restored French laws. But criminal laws were still British. Along the way, the British allowed religious freedom in the New World, and this whole set of laws went down in history as the Quebec Act. This is now considered one of the founding documents of Canada, but they rejoiced at the New World Order, as in 1776, the War for the Independence of the American States broke out, in which Canada happened to play a role of a key foothold for British loyalists. At the same time, the American independence fighters did not hesitate to declare that in their plans to create the United States, the territories of Canada would be part of the new state. Ironically, being three-quarters French-speaking, Canada was in no hurry to gain independence from the English crown, as well as cooperating with the American freedom fighters. They tried to invade Quebec in 1776, but all their attempts failed, mostly because the large landowners and merchants of Canada were tightly connected with the British Crown. The U.S. merchants fought for independence from duties, having their own large economy. But Canada, for the most part, traded only in furs through England. So for big business, taking part on the side of the United States in the conflict was a shot in the head. In the best case for Americans, the Canadian rich were neutral. And speaking about the peasants, the situation was also unclear. On the one hand, the lower strata of population traditionally act as an engine of revolution, and nearly 1,000 Canadians actually signed up for the U.S. military. But on the other hand, this detachment quickly deserted, and in Canada itself, the peasants reluctantly cooperated with the British, which, coupled with the neutrality of capital, predetermined the tacit participation of Canada on the side of England in the conflict. However, as we have already mentioned, not very active. And the war itself quickly moved to the south of the United States and became even more fun. France supported the Americans by entering the war on their side. But ironically, even this did nothing to change the position of mostly French-populated Canada. And when the USA won, the province remained under the rule of England, sheltering tens of thousands of British loyalists fleeing the American state. The only result was the division of Canada into Lower and Upper because of these same loyalists. For it turned out that the newly arrived Americans were not satisfied with the old French laws. Therefore, the territories where they lived were allocated to Upper Canada with the capital in York, which would later be renamed to Toronto. And the places where the French Canadians lived would be called Lower Canada, with its capital in Quebec. The peace did not last long, because at the beginning of the 19th century, the Second War for Independence broke out. Let the historians call it the Anglo-American War, but in fact, the Americans wanted to expand the territory at the expense of Canada, and British wanted, in turn, again made the United States their colony. In this conflict, Canada took a beating, because all events mainly developed on its border, but as it often was in North America, the only real victims of the conflict were Indians. They actually fought either on one side or on the other. Regardless of their affiliation, as a result of the war, all the tribes were resettled, imposed new laws, and even more infringed in their rights. And the United States and Britain, from that moment, moved on to cooperation and limited themselves to the status quo. The result of this war was the finalization of the current border between the United States and Canada, which had been dragging on until the middle of the 19th century. And the Canadians themselves moved west. After all, at the beginning of the 19th century, Canada was not even close to being as huge as it is now. It was a tiny province in the east of the continent. But in 1793, Shashak Mackenzie walked to the west coast of the country on foot. In 1794, George Vancouver sailed there and began to explore Orleans. We think there is no need to mention which city will be named after him. Maps of the territory were actively being drawn up, technologies were developing, and in 1836, Canada even launched its own railway. And everything was fine, except the fact that the results of the Anglo-American War were still stifling. After all, Britain almost left unattended their colony in North America and did not attend an improvement of its administrative and legislative system. The only thing the British did was pumping out goods and enriching local kinglets. That, in the conditions of widespread progress, pumped up the atmosphere in society. And that could not be called good. After all, the majority of inhabitants were still French, and among them, dissatisfaction with British governance was growing. Ironically, the English minority living in Upper Canada held the same ideas. This resulted in the Uprisings of 1837, which took place in both Lower and Upper Canada. they're usually divided into separate events. But now scientists agree that the leaders of the rebels of both Canadas cooperated and shared common goals, which have been achieved, but not by a victory in the rebellion. It actually ended in complete failure. The new Governor-General, John Lambton, even advised the Crown to speed up the flow of British migrants to Canada in order to make the French a minority and put an end to their unrest. But then, something went wrong. Indeed, the United States actively helped the revolutionaries, and the remoteness from the mother country did not make it possible to keep Canada by force for a long time. Also, they didn't really want to spend resources. In Europe, England also had hard times. Therefore, in 1841, the Upper and Lower Canadas were first united, believing that this would solve the problem. It did not turn out very well, because the crisis forced Britain to increase taxes and Canada began to suffer losses. The United States quickly took in the situation and, as a result, began to supply goods to the country. But in 1861, a civil war broke out in the United States, and Britain's attempt to intervene put Canada at a risk of invasion. The American government openly planned the attack to teach the British a lesson, and people of Canada realized that it was time to get independence. In 1864, representatives of the British provinces in Canada met in Charlottetown to discuss the issue of creating a confederation. Britain warmly accepted the intentions, believing that the unification of the provinces would force them to draw less money from the budget of the mother country. In 1866, in London, they discussed implementation of the idea, and in 1867, Queen Victoria gave her consent to the British North America Act, which created the Confederation of the Canadian Provinces de facto, which, by analogy with the United States, began with Quebec, Ontario, and 2 other territories, and ended up with every single province, one way or another, join the country. By the way, the last of those, Newfoundland, once visited by the Vikings, held out until 1949. Actually, in this form, Canada exists to this day, counting down its Independence Day from 1867, despite the fact that back then, there was not even the smell of the final independence. Canada did not withdraw from the British Empire. She only got the right to choose her own government, make laws, and engage in trade. But Canadians were still on the hook for the crown. However, for half a century, this did not prevent the happy representatives of the new country from doing what they love: the development of cold and sometimes icy territories, and the ascension of all kinds of British Columbias. In the second half of the 19th century, railroads were being built, gold rushes flared up, and Canada's industry finally flourished. Immigrants sailed into the country as they did to the US, settling on the prairies and digging for gold on the southern borders. Incomplete independence came back to bite Canada in the First World War, in which Britain, of course, dragged Canada. Initially, the Canadians gathered quite a lot of volunteers, but as the conflict started to stretch, discontent in the country also began to grow. First of all, it was connected with the unwillingness to go and die for Britain in thousands of kilometers from home. In 1917, the so-called draft crisis broke out, when French-speaking Canadians massively refused to join the army. The reason is simple: because the ruling minority was still English-speaking. At the front, they spread French speakers among the divisions, and the vast majority of the officers were English. That infuriated Canadians and caused serious riots in the country. At the end of the First World War, Canada lost 60,000 soldiers and another 175,000 were wounded. And it finally realized that it's worth ending with half-hearted independence. This happened in 1931. The Statute of Westminster finally recognized Canada as politically independent from Great Britain and allowed her to pursue her own policies. But the country still had to remain as part of the empire, which again led to a draft crisis at the beginning of World War II. However, on a much smaller scale, because this time, everyone understood the threat. 1 million Canadians will take part in the biggest military conflict in history. After that, the modern era of the country will begin, which will be marked by the huge influence of the United States on life in Canada. Culture, goods, and holidays were adopted. Americans began to influence politics through controlled lobbies. And in the second half of the 20th century, as in the good old times, Canadians would try to get rid of influence. Along the way, they would try to understand Franco-English internal conflicts. Quebec would oppress the British by teaching in French. The English provinces also would bully to French language. This, after a couple of conflicts, would lead to the establishment in 1868 of the official bilingualism of the country. Even trials are prohibited if they are held in one language. And Canada is trying to learn how to balance the needs of the two population groups. Actually, Quebec still would not be satisfied with this, and over again, it would try to secede from Canada. In the 1995 sovereignty vote, only a couple percent of the votes kept the province from independence. But even this did not prevent Canada from organically developing. The truth is still strongly dependent on the older brother in the face of the United States. This, however, does not prevent Canada from constantly appearing in the ratings of a high standard of living and attractiveness for immigration. But the history of the country is an excellent proof that the modern world is not static. We are still resolving conflicts that started a long time ago and continue the work of our ancestors. In the case of Canadians, these are, for example, questions of territories. Until now, not all regions of the country have been named, and even on the maps you can find the Northwestern Territories, which were last divided in 1999 and partially did not come up with names. Also, for several centuries, the country has been solving the problem of the population speaking different languages and correlating itself with 4 cultures at once. Indeed, in addition to France, the United States, and Britain, there are also Indians, which successfully assimilated with representatives of all of the above races. And they also represent a separate political and cultural force. The modern world is not the pinnacle of history. We are just part of it. And watching the process of change is incredibly interesting. Well, if you are interested in listening to our chatter, we will be very happy to hear upvotes and suggestions on the history of the following countries. See you next time, dear friends.